The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. We're going to be taking today an in-depth look at bicycle signals and how they can be used to improve safety and comfort at signalized intersections. Some of you may have joined us last October when Peter Kuntz was here to deliver a presentation on making signals work for bicyclists and pedestrians. Covered a lot of different topics during that session. One of those was bicycle signals, and we got some pretty clear feedback from you, the audience members who were there that day, that this topic, bicycle signals, was one we should just dive into in a whole session. So that's why we're back here today. I've got a great panel with me. My name's Dan Jaleen, by the way. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, Peter Kuntz, Rock Miller, and Dave Kirshner. Peter Kuntz is a professional engineer from Portland, Oregon, who has worked in both the public and private sectors and has also served as an adjunct professor at Portland State University, teaching graduate level courses in transportation engineering. He's a member of the Bicycle Technical Committee of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, representing the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. He formerly served as chair of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Traffic Signal Systems. Rock Miller is a professional engineer with over 40 years of traffic engineering experience. He was the president of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, or ITE, in 2012. He's participated in design of separated bikeways in communities throughout the U.S. and Canada. Finally, Dave Kirshner is here. He's a transportation specialist on the Federal Highway Administration's Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD team, responsible for pavement markings and bicycle signals. He has 12 years of experience in transportation planning, engineering, and project management in both the public and private sector. Dave's been with the Federal Highway Administration for 2 years with a focus on developing and promoting safe, clear, and effective traffic control devices for all road users. I'm really excited to have such a great panel here to talk about this topic, and we're going to get right to their presentations in just a moment. I have just a few housekeeping items to share with you. Before we do that, I'd like to ask the attendees on the line, if you can hear me, to please raise your hand to let me know that my voice is coming across and that my message is being heard. Great. Okay, excellent. Glad to hear that you all can hear me. You may know, as an attendee of our webinars, you're not going to have the ability to speak on the webinar today, so there's such a big audience, but you will have the ability and can at any time submit questions or comments to us using the questions pod there in your GoToWebinar control panel. If your computer for some reason freezes or you have trouble with audio, I'd encourage you to please reload the website and log back in. You should just be able to rejoin the session at that point. You can feel free, as I mentioned, to ask questions at any time. I may jump in if there's a burning question or two along the way, but we are holding about 20 to 30 minutes for discussion at the end of the presentation, so we'll be able to respond to a lot of your questions at that time. We've already posted a PDF copy of the slide presentations from the webinar today on our website. You can find it if you visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars and navigate to this webinar page. I'll also send that link out to you shortly, so you've got it at your right in front of you. We are also recording the webinar today. The recording should be made available on that same page within a couple of days. I should be able to get it up this afternoon even, so you can look back for that. You're going to get a follow-up email later today that'll include a few things. It'll include that link to the archive page that I mentioned, the slides, and eventually the recording. But it'll also have a link to a location where you can generate your own certificate of attendance for this webinar. So it's important to know that if you're attending this webinar with multiple attendees at your site, please be sure to pass that email along to them after the webinar so that they can also generate their own certificate of attendance. We do have webinars happening at least once a month, sometimes more often than that. We actually had a webinar yesterday. So if you want to stay up to date with all the webinars we have, you can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. We're also active on social media, and we'll be talking about this webinar today with hashtag PBICwebinar if you want to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Or you can sign up for our newsletter, pedbikeinfo.org/sign-up. Those are all good ways to keep track of the sessions that we have planned and coming up. We've got our next webinar. It's actually being sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety. It's coming up on Monday, April 30th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be hearing from some panelists from Florida and from Arizona about how they've gone about assigning crash typologies to their bicycle and pedestrian crash data to better understand safety and make safety decisions. So if that's a topic you're interested in, you can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars to learn more about that. I'll include some more information about that webinar in the email I send you later today. One final thing I forgot to mention, if you're a planner and you typically claim AICP CM credits, we have had this webinar approved for 1.5 CMs. So after the webinar concludes, if you can navigate over to their event website and track your credits over there, you should see it pop up. I don't have too many more things to get to before the webinar kicks off, but I would like to ask you all to help us understand how many people are out there by visiting or voting in this poll question here. It may be just you at the webinar attending from your location, maybe a few more or a larger group. We're just trying to get a better handle on the numbers out there today. So if you could take a moment and cast your vote in this poll, we'll move right ahead into our presentations. I'll leave this open for about 5 more seconds and then we'll go ahead and move on. Okay. I really appreciate your feedback, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now, and we'll move right into our presentations. So Peter Kuntz will be up first. Peter, I'm turning the screen over to you. If you could take a look and display your slides whenever you're ready. All right, you're all set. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Greetings, everybody. I'm looking forward to talking to you about bicycle signals. My role in this is just to get us started and have that conversation. So if you're in a room, in a webinar, I've been there myself, of course. Just make sure that you have somebody on the keyboard so you can ask questions. We will have some time, it seems like, to address those at the end of our session. We really do enjoy the feedback that we get through the chat box, so I just put in a plug for that to be active there and to really give us that, make this more dialogue than monologue, even though we have Rock and Dave in here as well that'll help spice this up a little bit, make it a little more interesting than just me talking to you through the screen. So with that, I will jump into the material just to talk a little bit briefly about the webinar outcomes. You know, our idea here is to try to make this bicycle signal idea come to life for you. We want to make intersections safer for people, so it was great to see the next webinar on the docket is that Monday. We're looking at individual crash types. So we're going to do a deep dive on understanding the elements of bicycle signals and then explore the interim approval and then steps to implementation. Rock at the end has some really great examples from both the U.S. and abroad. So my presentation, I'll give you a background on bike signals, some recent research, maybe just a call for research as well, and then Dave and I will both kind of get into the interim approval so you kind of know what we've been talking about, both at the National Committee of Uniform Traffic Devices and also within FHWA. So with no further ado, let's get started. So bicycle signals, common in Europe. So we are somewhat late to this game. So certainly if you travel in Europe and the Netherlands and Denmark, they have bike signals virtually everywhere. I think Davis is the first bicycle signal location. Rock can correct me if I'm wrong. I know Portland had ours just shortly after that, and I think it was in 2004 when our bicycle signal got in. So, for the next transportation trivia night, make sure you have that on your list. The interim approval is December 2013. So for bike signals, they're approved officially with that interim approval. So we'll talk about what that means later on. Back in I think we started that conversation in 2011 with we really don't know what people are doing and whether in Davis and other communities there are bicycle signals that are out there, and Canada actually had some as well. So the question became, well, somebody should do some research to identify what the state of the practice was. And so Portland State took that up as a kind of a research task, thankfully. And they had students do an amazing job of identifying the relevant guidance documents and then do surveys across the U.S. and Canada. Actually, Rock will talk about a survey he's doing to update that for the National Committee. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but the survey was really very interesting in terms of the distribution response that we got. And we found that there were quite a few agencies, 22 in fact, that we knew of, we could confirm. The light gray shading is agencies where we knew specifically that there were bike signals, either by one of the team members visiting. I was one of the panelists on that said, yes, I know there's a bike signal in these cities. And then we couldn't get survey responses from everyone, but we did get a good number of responses, and certainly a population of information to say what we could about where they were and how they were being designed. We went into the details, and I'll tackle that. So 21 municipalities in all, 63 intersections, and 149 signal heads. So you will think about this, and I think as Rock compiles his information, we know that there are hundreds of bike signals out there now. So that's something that this is dated information, this is early information. And what we found was that there were different motivations for use, so non-compliance with traffic signals. That was part of the reason Portland built its first bike traffic signal. There were contraflow reasons, so putting in a contraflow, we'll get into examples of that. Unique pass, I'll cover that as well. And then safety. So safety, of course, those crash types that can be mitigated with traffic signals also relate to bicycle signals. So Portland's first bicycle signal was this intersection. I'm sure you can't read that text. There's a lot of text on there, but this was the first try of, well, gosh, we should put information out there. So if someone is stopped, if they have never seen a bike signal before, what might they do? So this sign is circa 2004. Really just gives you the 1, 2, 3. I don't recommend use of this sign, although I've seen it copied. But it does provide a basic level of information that someone can identify how to use a bike signal. And you'll see, of course, the standard sort of marking on that side, the placement of wheels on the lines, the 9C7 marking from the MUTC. And really what we were trying to do here was to facilitate the diagonal crossing. On the bottom left of that picture is a path, the East Bank Esplanade. If you've ever been to Portland, you come up out of the river, and if you want to travel north, we previously had asked you to come out of that path, get to that diagonal, and then most of the demand is to go north. So we would have you operate as a pedestrian. We had people on bikes walking across or biking in the crosswalk, and then making the two-stage crossing. And this I have to give credit to Roger Geller for these slides and the animation here. So we found that just wasn't something that people are willing to do. We got a lot of non-compliance and a lot of people doing different behaviors. So the scramble in this case was, at that time, it was a scramble signal, which was a diagonal movement allowing bikes to go in that one stage, putting a traffic signal on the far side of the intersection so that you could get a separate green indication for people on bikes, and they could make that movement in one signal phase. That added a signal phase to the intersection, so that's now a 3-phase intersection instead of a 2-phase intersection. And there were other elements that we added as well to make that signal safe for people as they made this crossing. And the first part of that, of course, is we need to detect them. We need to know that they're there for the traffic signal to work. And this is an example. You can see the discolored concrete marks there, the concrete the panels. That's where we put in the detector. And then we marked that where the detector was with the standard MUTCD 9C7. So that's the bicycle stencil. That's to show someone that's on a bike where to place their bike. You can see the user there is not in the right spot. So that detector is sensitive enough. We have it sensitive enough to detect a wide range of locations in that area. But certainly that's the marking that's in the manual. There is some discussion about whether there are some improvements we can make to that marking. And of course, a whole range of things to think about related to the technology for detection as well, to see if you can do a better job picking up the bikes than an inductive loop. We use inductive loops mostly in practice because they're essentially the most reliable, but certainly there are other technologies, video, microwave radar, other technologies that can do the same thing at a traffic signal. There's a lot of information packed into that. So again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to ask them in the chat box. I'm happy to try to address those as we go. So so once we've detected that person, it's read for a good portion of time. Of course, we have to serve the other movements at the intersection, and then once the intersection is clear, we provide that green. The green is on the far side of the intersection. We use a lot of questions that we get related to bike signals as well. How much do they cost? And the answer in this case was, well, not a lot. We used the existing signal pole that was there. We mounted the bike signal on the far side of the intersection to the existing pole. We did have to run wire to that pole. But the cost was fairly minimal when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. So that's something to contemplate as you're considering the application of a bike signal. It isn't always this simple, and there are, of course, complications that come up. Once this bike signal was put in place, we had some complaints that the right turn traffic wasn't always expecting the bike from the diagonal movement. So in this case, the story that the engineers tell me is that they put up the no turn on red sign. They felt like that was helpful when they had the text in the no turn on red, but then the question was, well, there are some people that maybe aren't speaking or aren't reading the text from that sign, so putting up the dynamic display of the strikeout sign for the right turn on the mast arm was a secondary option that was used to ensure that there's just an added level of safety for the users that are out there at the diagonal crossing. But back to the survey that was done by Portland State, they did a really wonderful job of breaking down the various elements and the different cities and trying to get examples. So they had the examples from a wide cross-section of cities, of both signage. Long Beach, which Rock was involved in, had the text on the backplate as a way to communicate what what this traffic signal was about. Portland had some different examples with the number of bike signals, and then on the left, we in Portland have experimented, and we have a request to experiment with a blue light that's adjacent to the red. That top right is a small LED that lights up when someone is on top of the detector. So we give a confirmation that you've been detected. It's a very basic level of information. It's just a simple paddle tail light that we're repurposing for the purpose of bicycle detection. The mounting location was also surveyed, so we looked at Austin, Minneapolis, and of course in Portland we had some what we're calling Euro-style near side mounting locations at the smaller traffic signal. This is a version 1.0, I'd say, of a 4-inch signal indication, as opposed to the far side. Now, I do want to caution you that in some of these cases, these are not compliant with the interim approval. So we'll get into that in a few slides, but just to call out the Minneapolis one, the interim approval requires separation between the signal heads. And then one more note on this slide is Austin. They actually were the inspiration for the blue light. The bottom below what would be the green indication, you can see a blue light. That's where they mounted their detector confirmation. This is the first that I know of in the U.S. But Austin used this, and the sign says vehicle detected when blue light on. But this is a bike-only movement in Austin, and so that's pretty creative, and you have to give credit to Austin for being the first to think of such an application in the U.S. Moving on to placement, so near and far side signals. There's a wide variety of what people were doing related to that. The METC for the main movements requires 2 traffic signal heads for the main movements at the intersection. It's really at the discretion of the engineer to contemplate whether you should have 2. You can see Long Beach has 2 there on the mast arm on the that they've used to clarify this traffic control with the far side, and the Vancouver one has a near and a far side indication. So they tabulated those survey results, found the various data here. A lot of the signals were just on recall. That's probably the key element there. Good number of people were using push button only, some video and some inductive loop detector. Some people are, I think, and this is, I would say, a reasonable thing to do when if you have the flexibility and the capital dollars, is to do more than one detection. By building it into the design, baking it in there, you have flexibility to give your operations and maintenance staff a little bit of a chance to essentially to do the level best to make sure they detect all users at the intersection. And if you are interested in more information about that, we talked about that last time on the webinar back 6 months ago. So the lens type and detection, one of the things they found was that the lens was put in and wasn't always consistent. So some of them faced left, some of them faced right. Some of them were in a kind of an abstract format. So they went into the details there. And then information about, well, what is the detection? Is there information that's provided with the detection? So there's, again, a good range of information that's there. You can have an example of the Clackamas County, which I'll get into a little bit later. You can have the METC sign, the 10-22 sign, the 2 request screen wait on the stencil. You can accompany that with the 9C7 sign. The backplates are, of course, a safety and improved safety because the visibility can be enhanced. So we had some agencies that were matching the housing and backplates, some that were a little bit more haphazard, or no backplates, sorry. The examples where you just put up a signal head without a backplate, that's a possibility as well, but some that are mismatched. So there must be something about those Oregon agencies that they can't be seen to decide on a color between the backplate and the traffic signal head. And the reality is, I think sometimes it's in retrofit situations you get what you order. If the specifications don't come in just right, then you may get that mismatch. So we surveyed that as well. You can see things I'll just highlight here without going through the whole slide is lens type. There wasn't a lot of people that were using 4-inch signal heads at the time. I think, but that's something that certainly has applications. We have a good split of faces left versus faces right. Then the utilization of louvers. The louvers are the controls essentially the display. So only some users on the street can see it, and I'll give you an example of that as we come up here. So various placements again, a wide range of things to think about as we contemplate the signal design as we go. So kind of shifting gears now, we have the kind of the backdrop for bike signals. Shifting gears to the request to the METC team. What are they looking for? The notion of this, it's not in the 2009 edition of the METC. So at that time, it was really a request to experiment. And it's well documented. There are, of course, presentations on that as well. And several agencies have undertaken that. So Oregon Department of Transportation, just to highlight a few that I'm most familiar with, City of Chicago, Clackamas County, another Oregon Department of Transportation one, all having bicycle signal heads, and some having bike boxes as well. So there's a good bit of information that we could pull from. That information comes to the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. The Bicycle Technical Committee, this picture is actually from the Pedestrian Task Force meeting, but those same sorts of folks get around the room. Dave's often in there with us, Rock's on the committee as well, and we talk about these various things. So, and try to figure out what's the best way to pull all this information together and then help provide guidance to users. So after that deliberation, it goes to the Federal Highway Administration. and the Federal Highway Administration issued that interim approval in 2013, defining the uses for bicycle signal faces. Really, I think similar, looking at the data that's available, looking at the request to experiment, and Dave will talk a lot more about that. But this is the salient points that I pulled from the interim approval, is that's really to address bicycle noncompliance with the previous traffic control, to provide a leading or lagging bicycle interval, to continue the bike lane on the right-hand side of an exclusive turn lane that was previously not allowed via the METC and in the AASHTO guides. Augment the design of a segregated counterflow bike facility. We'll talk about that a little more detail. And then essentially complex intersections, conflict areas, or other signal control. So the NTTC interim approval specifically states some requirements. Requires a no turn on red without consideration of the intensity or volume of the conflict. These are kind of my points again on where I guess I'd say we've wondered if this is overly restrictive, or we've had some healthy debate at the Bicycle Tech Committee on this topic. Bicycle indications, identifying the flashing green as an option. We were interested in hearing more about that. You may be too. So if you have, again, this is a good time to get into the chat box and ask questions if you do have some. We have some differences in interpretation of what is protected only, and then finally requiring 3 feet of separation between signal heads. There are 4 more distinctions that I'll just point out. Arrows used as part of the bicycle signal to accomplish turn prohibitions. The bicycle signal sign installed immediately adjacent to every bicycle signal face. Restricting the use of bicycle signal face with pedestrian hydro beacons. And then finally, scramble phases shall not be used. So restricting that diagonal bike movement. I'll have an example where we talk about how we've addressed that particular. So Dave, I'll turn it over to you to kind of give the FHWA perspective, which I think, of course, is going to be very important as agencies consider the use of bicycle signals.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Just to back up a little bit regarding interim approvals, kind of a general picture. When we do an interim approval, it's because we have an abundance of research or experimentation pointing to a device that fills a need or a gap in the current MUCCD, in this case, the 2009 edition. So in 2013, when we adopted interim approval 16, which covers bicycle signals, we recognized that there was a gap in the current manual wherein this type of signal face would be useful. So we looked at the available data, we looked at the available experimentation that we had to that point, and we decided that based on the research and based on the results that we had, it was justified to move bicycle signal faces to an interim approval. And I'll talk a little bit about the distinction when I say, and Peter says, we talk about bicycle signal faces or bicycle signal indications. If the jurisdiction wants to use an interim approval, device under interim approval, the procedure is that they contact us at FHWA. They can go through the individual team members, or I believe there's an official request email box on the website. I'll give you an inside tip. Just if you want to get a quicker response from us, our names are all on the website under MUCCD team. Pick the appropriate team member whose technical area you're interested in and contact them directly, and you'll probably get a quicker response from us. We don't sweep that official request email box quite as often as we do our individual emails. But we adopted interim approval 16 in 2013, as we've said, and what that allows for is the use of bicycle signal indications or bicycle signal faces. Next slide, please. Thanks. I say that to make the distinction. Part 9 allowed in the 2009 edition for the use of standard circular traffic signals to control bicycle facilities. They could be set aside. Standard circular signal faces could be used to control bicycle facilities, but what IA-16 allows for is specifically the use of signal faces that include bicycle symbols or bicycle signal indications. And it sets those apart from those circular signal faces used for bicycle signals. Next slide, please. So as Peter mentioned, there are some restrictions that were put in when we issued interim approval 16 on the use of bicycle signal faces. Probably the biggest and most well-known is that it restricts the operation of bicycle signal faces where there are potentially conflicting motor vehicle movements. What that means in practice You cannot have a permissive motor vehicle turn, whether that's a right, left or right from the main line adjacent to the bike lane, or a right turn on red from the side street, while you are showing a green bicycle indication under an approved installation under IA-16, you cannot have a permissive motor vehicle movement across that bicycle movement. That said, as Peter noted, we get a lot of questions about this operation, and this is probably the most frequent thing we hear is feedback, that it's very difficult, given the delay that this can introduce with a separate signal phase potentially, to get signal engineers or traffic engineers to agree to install this. Next slide, please. So, as I noted, we've received many requests to relax this provision. At the time I'd written these slides, which I pulled from somewhere else, we didn't yet have any data or observations on this operation, allowing conflicting motor vehicle movements permissive across bike lanes where we had green signal indications. That said, we did decide that due to the abundance of desire from cities and experienced traffic engineers who know their field, who know their locations, that said, we believe this can operate safely. Despite the lack of data, we started to think, well, let's look at this in some select locations. We can, and reviewing the experimental plans, we decided that these are safe enough to allow to operate on an experimental basis, of course, pending the results and pending the success of the installations and their regular progress reports back to us. Next slide, please. So we've approved, I believe, 3 or 4 experiments with this operation. We have a couple more in review right now. These operate differently. Some of them, while you have conflicting motor vehicle movements, will show a green bicycle indication. Some of them, the jurisdiction was not comfortable with that operation, so they chose, while there is a conflicting permissive motor vehicle movement, they chose to show a flashing yellow bicycle indication. At most of these locations, what we're doing is we ask the jurisdictions to show motor vehicle movements that conflict with a bike lane, to show them a flashing yellow arrow to indicate there's an additional degree of conflict here that they may not be expecting, especially where you have a 2-direction or bidirectional bicycle lane that a turning movement is crossing. So what we ask when we do these experiments, we try to balance, of course, the time and resources of the jurisdiction that they have to conduct this experiment, but also with the knowledge that we need to gain to see if this is a safe operation at the end of the day. And what we ended up doing is we identified some critical observations that we want jurisdictions to make when they're doing these installations. Most critical, of course, is the conflicts and the interactions between the motorists and the bicyclists, where those conflicts are allowed. Are we seeing close calls? Are we seeing, hopefully not, are we seeing any actual collisions? And then we also ask these jurisdictions to do some intercept or some kind of public survey to see if motorists and bicyclists both understand the conflict, they understand their rights and responsibilities at these locations. For example, if you ask a bicyclist entering the intersection, if they see a green bicycle signal, what does that mean? Do they believe that there's a possible conflicting turning movement? Could a driver legally make a left turn across that lane while a green bike indication is shown to them? That's the kind of information that we need in the human factors area to understand what these traffic control devices mean to the road users when they see them. So that's it from me. I'll be around later on to ask some more questions. We do have some more experimentation, as Peter noted, that will probably come up a little bit later, but we are conducting experiments. Peter is helping us out with specifically the blue light for bicycle detection. That's something that we think has a lot of promise, not only for bicycles, but potentially for rural intersections as well, or for kind of side street intersections on high volume arterials that you may have something like a 3-minute cycle length where a driver may not be sure they're detected. So we think that's something that has a lot of promise, and we're looking forward to results on that. And with that, I'll give it back to Peter.
Thanks, Dave. So this picture from the interim approval is really, I think, what we've been, as practitioners, thinking about related to the application of bike signals is The guidance is there, requirements are there to eliminate the potential for a crossing conflict. As Dave mentioned, you can think about if you displayed a bicycle signal for that bike lane that's coming at the bottom of the screen there. If you have a bike green, are you giving the indication to someone that that they can go without risk of a conflict from a left turn movement that's coming in the opposite direction, or a right turn in that parallel direction, or the same direction, that's just crossing over the path? So this distinction here is trying to figure out, again, how to prohibit someone riding a bike coming up that lane and deciding to make a left turn out of that bike lane. So the arrows are there to provide that guidance, that requirement that someone does not make the left turn from the rightmost bike lane, so that they don't immediately consider that as like a diagonal crossing. Our examples that are similar to that in Portland are a couple of these that I'll show. Here is we had the right turn bike conflict with a dual right situation. This is another one of those examples that was, I remember as a consultant doing the analysis of this, and the first time I was doing the traffic analysis, I think the engineer I was working with, we were brainstorming some ideas, and he said, well, what about just leaving the bike on the right hand side? And I said, well, that's not allowed. That's not, you can't possibly do that. And I thought that was the end of the conversation. But then a few months later, the concept that was approved was this specific concept, which is to signalize the right turn separate from this bike signal, have the bike signal be a separate phase, and certainly the control of that with right turn arrows, the bike signal sign and the through green arrows does that. The concern in the interim approval that's there is, again, concern that bicycles, assuming they can cross to the left, it's addressed here in having the one-way. It's a one-way off-ramp. So this is a application that is allowed in the interim approval under the way I see it, except with some small exceptions. I think the bike signal sign in this case, we show the bike graphic, but we also repeat the text. You don't need to do that, of course. That was something that without guidance, we ended up with the text there. Dave, do you want to talk any more about kind of critiques of this intersection? This was one that I remember doing some analysis and design on before I started in Portland, and was curious to your perspective on this as well.
No, I mean, I think that this is actually a pretty good example of one of those questions that it's going to be very hard to solve how you get a bicyclist through this intersection without using a bike signal in this manner. And I think this is kind of the classic case of, how do we make this as safe as possible when we assign the right of way to this intersection? So it's, I think this is kind of the idea of the interim approval, pretty much by the book right here. So nothing particularly comes to mind. I will say I'm almost embarrassed that the previous idea was to have the bike movement in between the two turn lanes, and that clearly did not work. This is one of our highest bicycle crash locations in the city, and the bicycle signal has virtually eliminated the crashes that were occurring because of the separation. Actually, one of the best things that happened, I think I do not believe it was intentional, is the gentleman that's sitting there in the vest, the construction worker. He actually helped to provide a little bit of a guest, helping people on bikes know that this was for them, that we wanted to stop them, we wanted to keep them safe. There, of course, so he was kind of our counselor for the first week, basically telling people that they should stop for the bike signal, and that compliance is good. The other thing I will say is that
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to cut in, Peter, real quick, because I was going to say that the recommended designs for something like this, where you're probably doing at least one of those right turn lanes as a drop lane, or as as an add lane, and then one of them kind of transitions from a through to a right. The design for this is kind of, there's really not a lot of good options. And usually what ends up happening is you have to end that bike lane in advance and then pick it up, kind of like you said, between the leftmost right turn lane and a through right lane, and it's just not a really good situation for anybody. And so using the signal in this case allows you to keep those bicyclists in the same place. They don't have that conflict of merging across traffic to get into that lane, and then they're not in a situation where they're proceeding in a painted bike lane and then having moving motor vehicle traffic on either side of them. So I think the bike signal in this case really enables, like you said, a much safer operation.
I will just say the PTR is part-time restriction sign. So that blank sign there, next to between the right turn only sign and the bike signal, that says no turn on red. So it just highlights as soon as the bike signal is green, it comes up and just clarifies the static no turn on red sign that's already there. There's that blank out sign and the part-time restriction sign that comes on, just the text indicating the no turn on red. Another example, this is from Clackamas County. They have a regional trail, the Springwater Trail, crossing Johnson Creek Boulevard. The diagonal crossing is what's going on there. The interim approval disallows some diagonal crossings without PEDs. So if you want to meet the interim approval, a very simple way to do that is to include pedestrians with that movement. So you eliminate the lack of just a scramble. So in that case, we're seeing both the movements happening at the same time. The previous example was just a two-stage crossing, so you had to cross over without the diagonal signal. You had to cross the crosswalk, go to a very small landing. So that was very, very undesirable with a building that's really very close to the right-of-way. So they retrofitted this intersection, provided the markings there, put green below the standard 9C7 marking that's not specifically allowed with the existing METC. But it was something they were trying just to communicate to users what they intended for people to do. Dave, you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, we've had a couple of requests. I know there's an experimental design for that detection marking. There's been an experiment that I can't recall exactly who performed it. Peter or Rock, you probably remember, but they showed positive results with a different detection marking that kind of spelled out more what wait here to request green or something like that was the text on it. And I think that we've been talking about that internally, and I think we may end up releasing something on this. But if you want to use something like the wait here or a word marking with that detection marking, where you have a situation where that observation indicates that a bicyclist might not understand what that detection marking is, or they think it's some different kind of bike lane marking, it's compliant with the METCD to install some word markings with that. Wait here to request green, or wait here, bicyclist wait here, or something like that. So it is compliant to install some word markings, and we're thinking about how to maybe clarify that. We don't get a ton of questions about it, but I know it's something that's been talked about. So that's something we're thinking of clarifying as far as that bicycle detection marking.
Great, thanks. So that's the marking there. You can see that in the foreground, the bike green, the bike only. They use text on the backplate. Again, that's not allowed in the interim approval. But they did have the bike signal sign, and they also have the right turn restriction to try to clarify what the users are supposed to do. The last example I'll just highlight is a contraflow example. This one from Honolulu, it's King Street. Rock has a good amount of experience with these contraflow with some of the work that he's done, and he will talk more about this. This is an example where people on bikes that person is going on the green with the walk. In this case, that left turn, that vehicle that's immediately to the left of the cyclist in the opposite direction is able to make a left turn across this movement in a permissive manner. And so this would not be allowed in the interim approval. The way to make it consistent with the MHCC is just to change the bicycle stencil in the traffic signal with a green ball. That would be allowed. That would be a more standard permissive movement that anybody would see. So that's the sort of the state of the practice. If you're thinking about using the interim approval, and I will turn it over to Rock for a little more detail related to some of the applications and a few more bits of information about bike signals.
Thanks. And Peter, before we get to Rock, we'll get you set up in just a second. There are a few questions that we had pertaining to some slides in this deck, so I wanted to maybe jump to those if we can. And in fact, if you could navigate back, Peter, to your North Williams, Broadway at Williams, this one here. So one of the questions has to do with whether the bicycle signal can help accommodate, in this position, let's take this as an example, accommodate a left turning bicyclist from this position. And from what I'm gathering, this is not the intended application for a bicycle signal here, is to accommodate a left turn. Could you talk about what a signal could do for left turning bicyclists here? Or would there be another treatment like a two-stage turn box or something like that that would be better to use for a left turn?
Yeah, that would be our preferred recommendation. Recommended application is a two-stage Q box. So getting the bicycle movement across the intersection and then over to a Q box so they can make a two-stage movement. Mm-hmm. The expectation of being able to make a left from the rightmost, in my experience, most travelers do not expect that. A good number of people may of course take the lane to go to a left turn, but if you have folks that are maybe on the interested but concerned, we would probably use a two-stage Q box for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then just breaking down the process for how, since the picture isn't necessarily phased to show exactly how the system works for someone who may not be as familiar, what the bicyclists are going to receive is the green bicycle signal while the right turns are restricted, and that's where the PTR is activated at that time when the bicyclist receives green.
Sure. What happens is upon the yellow of the side street, the part-time restriction sign will come on. Mm-hmm. So a few seconds in advance. We use louvers in this case. So the far side bike signal is if you were in that black pickup truck, you would not be able to see that red indication for the bike signal or the green indication. All you're able to see is your arrows, the right turn arrows, the red right turn arrows. So as someone on a bike, it is able to pick up that red, yellow, and green in the bike signal. Okay. So that first interval of time is green arrows like you see on the left, and green for the bike signal. And then the bike signal goes yellow after a certain amount of time. I think it's 8 to 12 seconds depending on the demand. And then red, I snap this picture. Right as the bike signal has a short all red interval to clear the cyclist. And then the next seconds will be the green arrows coming up for the right turn. So okay. That's the sort of progression of intervals of time in the traffic signal.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. And then the only last question was on the example from Hawaii that you showed. You mentioned making that compliant would involve using a green ball instead of. Could you just say that one more time? I think that was a missed point. How to turn this into something that would actually be compliant.
Yeah, so the concern, I think, with the integral, and Dave, you can talk about this more if you like. The concern is that somebody will see the bike green and think that they can make a left out of this contraflow across King Street in this case. And
yeah, sorry, my computer went to screensaver here. Let me bring it back. Not necessarily. The concern here was more that the white SUV making a left turn. My understanding is that that's a permissive movement. And that goes back to the question that we're trying to learn more about, which is the implication of that green bicycle indication when it's seen by a bicyclist. That do they understand that that's a potentially conflicting movement, and that driver, if they see an opening, they can take that gap and turn across the bike lane even though they see a green bicycle indication. So the use of a green ball would be permissible there without the interim approval, because you're not using that bicycle indication.
Okay, great. Well, let's. We've got some more questions coming in. I'd like to get to Rock's presentation now. Make sure we have time for that, and then we'll shift back toward Q&A mode. Thanks, guys, for going back through some of that. And now we're going to turn to Rock Miller. And Rock, take a look at your screen. You should be getting the controls passed to you now. I now see your screen, and you're all set up and ready to go. Thanks, Rock.
Well, that's great, and I hope you can all hear me. I might, before I start, the question involved how would a bicycle be able to make a left turn at that photograph that Peter was showing. One of the locations I have observed is in Sacramento, California, where they've basically got that similar situation, but the bike comes up in a short interval with a left turn arrow. Then the bicycle is terminated completely. Relatively low volume of vehicles and bikes go straight. So it seems, just from my own viewpoint, to be working, but I don't know if anybody from Sacramento is watching and will be able to share the experience with us. But a little bit of, I think you said everything would need to be said about me, but there's my phone number and one of the various email addresses you can use to reach me. As Peter said, I am on the National Committee and the Bicycle Technical Committee, as well as Peter. I do a lot of reasons to vacation in Europe just to see what's going on there, and I kind of wanted to give you all a glimpse of what kind of a standard bike signal looks like there. Although these are both Danish examples, virtually every country in Europe that I've seen that uses bicycle signals actually has that blue indication with the bicycle symbol on top of the signal. So their movement towards standardization is a little bit different than ours, but it's just something to keep in mind. They have so many there that they've basically chosen to go with that particular design. This is a pretty typical intersection in Copenhagen, which I think looks more like what the US looks like, with a minimal application of bike infrastructure compared to the Netherlands. There are bicycle indications at most every intersection. They quite often come on a few seconds before the green for the vehicle, so the bike gets a head start. They quite often go red a few seconds before the end of the vehicle interval, so that the bicycle is fully cleared before any side streets will get a green indication. I've been trying to collect videos of bicycle signals in operation. I find it's easier to understand what's going on when you have a video. This is a rush hour in Copenhagen. You can see the vehicle signal. If you can see my arrow, the vehicle signal is right there with a right turn arrow that'll come on later. That's a bicycle signal underneath it, as well as a pedestrian signal to the one side. About 100 bicyclists crossed this intersection during this signal phase. A lot more bikes than cars, I might add. And if you watch that vehicle signal, the bikes have now gone yellow. The bikes are now gone red, and a right turn arrow has come on for the vehicles. As you can imagine, it would have been permissive for vehicles to make a right turn during that signal phase. However, it was pretty much physically impossible for any vehicles to do it due to the heavy volume of bicycle flow at the intersection. If any of you have videos you've taken of bicycle signal operation, would love to find a way to share them. I've found that seeing videos of the operation helps to really add to the understanding of how they work or could work compared to just still shots. These are a couple pictures in my own area of the world of one of the reasons why you should consider bicycle signals. The photo on the left is a recreational trail that you can see kind of going down into that green space. A bicyclist on that trail approaching this intersection really has no way of knowing what color the traffic signal is. If it's green for the opposing through direction, they probably could proceed reasonably safely on a bicycle, but if it's in a left turn arrow or a cross street movement, they really don't know, so they have to be pretty smart and understand how traffic signals work. A bike signal might be a useful tool to simplify this operation, particularly if the number of bicycles using this facility was high. Intersection on the right is a pretty typical suburban intersection of a couple 6-lane streets with dual lefts and dual rights. A lot of these intersections in my area of the world are pretty empty on weekends, and a bicyclist wishing to turn left at this intersection actually would have to engage both of the long pedestrian signal crossings, probably tie up the intersection for other users for probably a minute and a half just to go through the walk, don't walk cycle that would be necessary to cross that intersection. Bicycles can move quite a bit faster than pedestrians, and if they were served by a bicycle interval, you would not have near as much delay for everybody as you get when you're basically serving it with kind of a more typical US installation. This is another typical application, a couple of T intersections. There's really no way for a bicyclist to cross to make the left turn at this T intersection in the US without using the two crosswalks to get across from the lower right-hand corner of the intersection across the first crosswalk, then energize the walk signal and cross the second to be able to proceed to turn left. Intersection on the right is a fairly typical Danish intersection. They love these blue markings, although they're not great about maintaining them in older intersections, but they basically serve the intersection so that a bicyclist can proceed during the crosswalk on the far left. They can also proceed in a bike lane on the near crosswalk. So basically all movements by bicycles are served, and they use a lot of interesting and intricate overlap mechanisms in order to make this possible there. They do have certainly a lot more experience than we do in bicycle operation. This is an example of what a North American city has tried to do without the benefit of bicycles, and it kind of shows you some of the challenges of creating an operation that people understand. Montreal has quite a few signalized crossings of two-way bike paths on the what would be the left side of a one-way street. All of them are controlled by having this leading up arrow interval, which is supposed to mean you're not to make a right turn during that interval. And then a few seconds later, it comes on with the green ball, which intends that the car can now make a right turn across the bicycle phase as long as they observe a gap in the bicycle traffic. I don't know really well how these have worked. I've seen some published articles on bicycle traffic safety in Montreal, and the conclusion is that bicyclists that are using the intersections in unanticipated ways seem to be causing more safety problems than the bicycles that are using them as designed. I am in the process of updating the users of bike signals for the US. We have about 100 known intersections in the US that have bicycle indications, averaging over 2 per indication, so we're probably approaching 250 bicycle indications in the city. I personally know of another 100 in Canada. I've been responsible for a few of them, and I've watched a few of the others. Canada is not subject to the US MUTCD. Their MUTCD is largely based upon ours, but they've given the cities using them a little bit more flexibility to decide when to use them. Any of you that are watching this that happen to have bicycle signals, we would love to get the information from you on the number of bicycle signals you have and any tidbits of information you can give on operational experience. We know a lot of bicycle signals out there are in operation that have not followed the experimental process, and we're trying to get the positive as well as the negative information from them on what's working and what needs to be worked a little bit more closely. We have found that the large downtowns with one-way streets do tend to install more bike signals than other locations, perhaps because of a desire to make the downtown more bike-friendly. They do tend to work pretty well on downtown one-way streets, and there are a lot of pluses when they're on the left side. They avoid transit operations, which occur on the right side. Peter said that you can do it fairly economically if you happen to have a pole left. This is one of the 20-odd poles that had to be installed in Long Beach, California in order to provide for the intended operation. They are not exactly in compliance with the interim approval, in part because of the lack of separation between the bike signal and the vehicle signal. California has allowed bike signals for quite a few years prior to the MUTCD interim approval. As a result, when this was designed in construction, there wasn't a lot of guidance on how to do it, and we basically used common sense as well as examples that were coming out of other cities, specifically New York City. This is kind of an example of an intersection in New York City, which again shows the bicycle signal on the left side of the one-way street, and you can see that it's controlled by left turn arrows on the other side. They've probably got these, I would imagine, probably in 20 to 30 locations right now, but we're waiting information from New York to add to our list because we think they've got a lot of them, and we do not have an actual accurate count at this time. Some other typical treatments, this is shown in Chicago. It was built not long after the Pro Walk Bike Conference was held in Long Beach, California, and it looks quite a lot like the Long Beach operation in terms of the way the signals were installed and operated. And I'd always wished we had done it slightly different in Long Beach, and that was kind of interesting to see that Chicago had copied Long Beach and probably didn't learn the same. On the right is Calgary, Alberta, where I had a pretty significant role in this project. We followed a unwritten warrant guideline that was set by the City of Vancouver, BC, in which we were kind of looking for where the conflicting volume between turning vehicles and through bikes was 150 vehicles or more. And we did special treatments for separation there. We did not do the special treatments at locations where the conflicting volume of cars was substantially less than that. It's been in operation for 2 summers, 3 years now, and I know the city has made some adjustments since the initial installation, but we're thinking some kind of a warrant based upon user experience might be possible in the long run. I've got a lot of experience with this project near me in Redondo Beach. It's a 2-way bikeway adjacent to 2-way traffic. It's very close to the beach, and as a result, it gets a lot of recreational use by all ages and abilities cyclists. Pretty good compliance with bike signals there. We have 3 signalized intersections with 3 control variations, so we've been able to kind of observe what works well and what doesn't work well. One thing I'd like to say before I show any videos is that it gets pretty heavy use, and it's a pretty safe bet that most of the people cycling in this photograph probably aren't used to cycling on other facilities. This is a pretty typical Southern California beach scene, and it's a pretty safe bet that a lot of these people only bicycle when they go down to the beach and rent bicycles. I took this shot on a Memorial Day weekend, a little bit heavier than average, but this is a pretty typical usage of this location during any summer weekend when the weather is fine. On opening day, I was standing by one of the corners on this facility, observing whether we were going to have a crash every day. And I saw a mother talk to about a 6-7-year-old person traveling with her and basically said, "Oh, look, it's a bicycle signal. That's for us. We have to observe that one." So kind of a lesson there on educational needs for bicycle signals. People do tend to understand what they mean, and as long as we communicated the right message, we're probably going in the right direction. I do have a video of this same facility under a little bit less traffic load, just to give you an idea of how it might work. This is a typical weekday when the sun is out. You can see we violated the guideline because it didn't exist when we were designing this, but California allowed bike signals. Vehicle has a red, through vehicle has a green. The bicycle signal, which is not quite visible, is also green. The bicycle signal, if you can see my arrow, is in the middle, the right of the picture right there. It's going to go yellow fairly soon, and then the vehicle is going to get a green arrow and proceed pretty happily. My own observations of this location is that the compliance is pretty good. They're more apt to see vehicles turn right on red than anything else, which is not intended by the operation. Compliance by bicycles is generally pretty good. Some other phasing strategies I know agencies are using is whether the vehicle interval or the bicycle interval should be leading or lagging with respect to each other. I see better compliance when the bicycle gets the early interval and the vehicle gets the lagging turn interval. Bikes do tend to proceed on the vehicle arrow straight when a vehicle arrow comes up first. Exclusive bike-only phases, especially when they're short, I do tend to see less compliancy among those signals from bicyclists. They tend to not arrive during the 8 seconds the phase is green. As a result, as soon as they determine that there is light cross traffic, they'll just go. That's something we probably need a lot more observations of, but it does seem to be the net experience of me. It has helped also to display the vehicle right turn arrow after the bicycle phase is clear, because it allows the bicycles to clear the intersection and not be in a conflict situation with a phase that's going to be cross traffic if it takes the bike a lot longer than the yellow phase to turn green. A few cities have timed the traffic signals for bicycle speeds to produce a so-called green wave. That seems to also have some benefits because it tends to put the majority of the bicycles into a platoon early in the start of the green phase, which produces much larger gaps in traffic for vehicles that want to turn across the bikeway late in the phase where a permissive interval is being allowed. A lot of you have probably seen these diagrams of the protected intersection, which is a copy of an intersection that's quite often used in the Netherlands and in other European communities. I have seen variations of this used in the Netherlands, and quite often they do include the separate treatment for the right turn arrows. It does provide for an opportunity for a bicyclist to enter the intersection long before a car. But if they have those 150 to 200 or more right turns across the intersection, they will quite often have a right turn arrow that operates often on an overlap with the cross street's left turn. Those of you that design traffic signals probably know how we operate the right turn intervals. It has occurred to me that our big multi-phase intersections may not actually have enough outputs to do what I see in Europe, where often the bike interval is delayed a few seconds or leaded a few seconds over its vehicle interval, and then is terminated to serve a right turn interval or just to stop the rights to allow vehicles to turn. So we'll probably learn more and more in the future, and I wonder if we're going to actually run out of traffic signal outputs. Conclusions from me, the signals themselves don't cost that much money. If you have to install a pole and a mast arm on the left side of the street, they do. The intersections in Long Beach and in Calgary probably added $40,000 to $50,000 per intersection in order to provide the necessary vehicle turn signals and the bicycle turn signals. There are probably a dozen or so early adapters, such as Peter and myself and the people from Canada and Vancouver and Seattle and other places that are installing a lot of them. And we would welcome the input from more people, especially people that have got information about what's working and what's not working. Our design guides are all citing knowledge gaps. We think that there is more knowledge out there than we can assemble in one place. And we know the MUTCD is trying to keep up. We know a lot of projects are really well in front of the MUTCD for one reason or another. So that's my 20 slides. So I can turn it back to the controller people and sit around and listen to questions.
All right, excellent. Thanks very much, Rock and Peter and Dave as well. Let me get the screen back. What I'm going to put up on the screen now is just a closeout slide that we'll have up during discussion. It has contact information up because I can tell you we're probably not going to get through every single question. We'll do as well as we can, but I'd like you to have the option to reach out to some of our panelists directly. If you'd like to reach out to us, pbac@pedbikeinfo.org is a good one to use. We can catch up with you there. So let me start off and ask a sort of a general question, Peter and Rob.
You have a typo of my email address.
Oh.
So it's SoCal, not social.
Huh.
But I believe everybody's going to have access to a PDF of the presentation. So if you can get that fixed, great.
There we go. I'll get it posted online too. So let me ask a question, and something, Rock, you touched on. Related to guidance for using bicycle signals. You all walked through a lot of the technical details of how they work. There are a lot of questions that are coming up about, okay, how do I know if I need to use a bicycle signal at a particular location? What are the processes? What are the questions I need to be asking? Am I looking at thresholds for the number of bicyclists traveling at the intersection? Am I looking for specifically those right turn conflict points where I'm seeing a lot of right turn movements? It doesn't sound like there are formal warrants for using bicycle signals. So what are some of the those decision-making criteria that you point people to, or is it a combination of these factors and really a lot of engineering judgment?
Yeah, I don't think we have enough information to put out there what would be a warrant. Although I think eventually we might have a lot more information. I kind of based my decision making on discussions I had with people in Vancouver, BC. The Long Beach project, which was my first bicycle signal project, we pretty much followed the guidelines that were put into the interim approval to eliminate virtually all conflicts. And I felt that we probably were doing some excessive design based upon what I was seeing there. In discussions with Vancouver, BC, they had told me that it seemed like they were getting into some safety or excessive conflict issues when they were seeing more than typically 150 or so vehicles turning across the bikeway. And those were the locations where they're coming back and retrofitting with turn signals and bicycle signals so that they could alternate control through the intersections. I've more or less used that 150 as a guideline. in my later designs, which most of them are in Canada actually. So again, I don't have to be that responsive to the US MUTCD. That seems to be working, but most of the locations are in or near downtown locations where there's a lot of pedestrian traffic and bicycle traffic. And I don't think it's been that unreasonable to expect the vehicles, they know they need to yield to the pedestrians, and it's therefore perhaps more reasonable for them to know they yield to bicycles. But I think experience will tell us. But I start out with, do you have a lot of turns across the bikeway?
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good start, Rock. I think the other part of this is I just would say it's with any warrant for ped or bike, we have to be careful on the flip side of how many pedestrians or bikes crossing would warrant a bike signal, because you always don't know that answer unless you have a safe facility, a safe and comfortable facility. And in some of those cases, we, as engineers, we stand behind the warrants and say there's just not enough people trying to walk across or bike across the intersection. So think broadly, work with your planning folks to identify, if we had a safe crossing here, what is that right volume that would come in and cross, and that's really a good place to start. What sort of policy do you have here? Because we don't have hard and fast warrants.
Yeah. Okay. And Rock, the threshold that you mentioned, the 150, could you mention what the parameters again, the high low on that? And
that's basically the vehicle turn volume across the bikeway, which was resulting in excessive conflicts or collisions at least one city that was one of the earliest adapters of two-way bike facilities in a downtown area.
Okay.
And as I said, I've kind of used that as a guideline. It's been a lot easier to follow when there is a turn lane. Where I know we're ultimately going to be more challenged is where we do not have room to put in a turn lane that we can control with a red arrow, and we want to put up a bicycle signal, and we want it to be green for longer than a few seconds prior to when the vehicle signal turns green.
Yeah, and that's the scenario that comes up again and again in some of the questions we have, is the locations where it's not a dedicated turn lane that's being controlled with the cycle track, but it's really just that desire to have the permissive left, and then all of this, those vehicles need to yield to the bicyclists who may have their own signal. And it sounds like currently this can't be done, but that's where maybe it's headed, or what we're experimenting with now.
Yeah, and again, to underscore, I'm thinking in the end we might have some answers, but we just don't have enough data from enough places where they're being used to be able to come up with an answer now.
Okay.
And as we've both indicated, I think the volume of bicycles needs to be a consideration, and whether or not there are pedestrians heavily using the adjacent crosswalk is a consideration as well.
Right. Okay. A question along these same lines about whether cities.
Sorry, Peter.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick on that one. Sorry, Dan. The one thing I just wanted to add was that as with signal warrants, I think most of these processes and signal warrants in the MUTCD are specifically a should statement rather than a shall statement. And one of the reasons behind that is that if you're in a situation where you don't have a facility now, kind of like Peter alluded to, you can use projections or expectations, and if you're confident in those, if those are based on an engineering study, based on engineering judgment, you can go ahead and move forward based on something like that. So it's not, we've all seen, I think, the analogies of installing a crosswalk or installing a signal, making an analogy to, well, how many people want to cross the river? How do you know if the bridge isn't there yet? And this could be one of those situations as well. So that's something you can consider as well. It's, and I think as we move forward and we consider that, I think that we'll keep in mind as well from the FHWA side that it's hard to measure things that are, so difficult under current conditions as to be impossible. And I think that's something that engineering judgment can take into account when making this decision as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Dave. I think we often hear about the MUTCD getting discredited, but it's the application. The MUTCD gives you a lot of flexibility to do what is the right thing for your community and based on policies. So just exercise those where you can, and work with the engineers to try to communicate what it is you're trying to accomplish or what it is that you're expecting in the future.
A lot of questions about whether or not there's work underway to evaluate the use of a flashing yellow arrow for vehicles during the bicycle signal phase as a way to maybe approach this idea of a permissive left. Are there any agencies using the flashing yellow arrow in this way? Or are you aware of it?
Yeah, there are a couple of agencies experimenting. I can't recall exactly how many chose to do that configuration versus another one. I believe we have 3 agencies currently experimenting with that signal design. Off the top of my head, I believe St. Paul, Minnesota is one of them, and we had another one potentially in South Carolina. I'd have to go back and make sure. But yes, experimentation is underway with that, and one of the things that we asked those jurisdictions to give us as part of their progress reporting and their ultimate final report on those experiments is to somehow get from drivers, specifically from drivers, how, what do they interpret when they see that? And ultimately, that's what we're trying to learn, is that what does that flashing yellow arrow convey to a driver? What's the message versus a standard intersection? Ultimately, our hope is that, and our intention was that flashing yellow arrow helps a driver understand that there's an additional degree of conflict at these locations that you don't necessarily have at other locations. Mm-hmm. But we're hoping to start getting progress reports from those experiments pretty soon. And once we're able to share some results, we'll definitely try and do so.
Great. Thank you,
Dave. So if someone is looking at a flashing yellow arrow, you would suggest they do a request to experiment?
Flashing yellow arrows by themselves do not need a request to experiment. They're under interim approval, I believe. I'm not the signals technical lead, so excuse me if I step out of line on that. But where we do it. The experimental part in conjunction with bike signals is that these jurisdictions have been asking to allow permissive movements across a green bicycle signal. And because that operation is prohibited by the interim approval, that's where the request to experiment comes in. We're stepping outside of the bounds of that interim approval. And so the use of the flashing yellow arrow is kind of to address our concerns that potentially where you have this green bicycle indication, the degree of conflict may not be immediately obvious to both the driver and the bicyclist. And so the flashing yellow arrow for the drivers is one of those ways that we're attempting to communicate that additional degree of conflict where you have a bike lane, and especially a two-way bike lane that a driver is turning either permissive right or permissive left across that bike lane. It's basically just another way to help communicate that there's another operation here that you need to be aware of. And some of the other things we're doing there is we're making sure that all of our experimentation in this area uses lane extension markings, uses green coloring for those bike lane extensions across the intersections wherever possible, just to make sure that bicycle path across the intersection is extremely visible and extremely conspicuous.
Right. Thanks very much. And I'm told by our local experts in New York City that bicyclists in New York City can find some examples of flashing yellow arrow and bicycle signals there. I'm told First Avenue and East 61st Street. So if you're riding around, take a look. Let's move on. There are a lot of other questions I'm trying to get to while we're here. And several of them actually are asking about calculating the standard clearance interval that you're using for a bicycle signal. A lot of questions about this, folks who maybe aren't used to using a bicyclist speed to calculate some of these clearance intervals. So who would like to weigh in on the guidance for that part of it?
I can jump in a little bit on that one. I don't agree with the equation entirely, but there's an equation in the California version of the MUTCD that indicates the minimum green length for a bicyclist to be able to start and clear the intersection. I do believe that the equation is a couple seconds too long, but that's a written source that people can go to find it out. My personal experience has been that in California, you can enter the intersection up till the last microsecond of yellow. And that does put you in conflict with the cross traffic probably for the next 2 or 3 seconds. And for that reason, ultimately, a bicycle signal terminating prior to a vehicle signal might be something that we'll consider looking at. That is used very widely in the leading European countries.
Okay.
I think it's 14.7 feet, though, is the 85th percentile speed that they measured.
All right. And then another question, getting back to on the MUTCD.
Sorry, and can I just jump in
Yes,
real quick?
please.
I know that this is something that is going to be discussed a little bit further. I've seen early drafts of the upcoming potential update to the AASHTO bike guide, and I know this is a specific priority to address in a little bit more detail in the update to the AASHTO bike guide as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Dave. While we're on the MUTCD topic, another question came up about we talked way earlier about the bicycle detection feedback light incorporated into the signal, and the question is, does that require MUTCD approval? Can anyone weigh in on that question? Whether the feedback light?
Yeah. Yeah. So that is experimental right now. Portland and Peter are experimenting with that, and we're pretty encouraged by some of the things we've seen so far, and I think we at the MUTCD team like the device and potentially like where it's going. As I mentioned real quick as well, not just for bicyclists, but for motor vehicles as well, where you have intersections that have a really high cycle length, and you tend to start to see red light running in those locations. Right now it is experimental though, and if you had any questions, you can contact me, and I'm happy to walk you through it as far as what we'd like to see for an experimental installation, and kind of the to help if you need to craft an experimental kind of review plan for the location as well. So yeah, we are interested in learning more about that, and interested in, we would potentially approve some additional locations for that treatment as well. I think we think that has a lot of promise.
Okay, great. There are, based on the survey we took during registration, there are a lot of folks, I think, attending the webinar today who don't yet have bicycle signals and are maybe wondering or considering whether they'll use them. And one of the questions I think a lot of them have had today is what do we know about compliance with the bicycle signals? There's question, I think, or there's some wariness, I guess, about what if we put them in, are folks going to comply with them? And Rock, you got at this a little bit in your example, I think from maybe it was Long Beach or somewhere else. Can you talk a little bit about what we know about bicycle signal compliance? Rocker and Dave and Peter, any of you who'd like to weigh in?
I've only done personal observations at locations that I can visit readily. I've seen statistics that show bicycle signal compliance in the 80 to 90% range. My personal observations are that if the bicycle signal is green for a relatively short amount of time, and then a vehicle signal is green for a much longer amount of time, which would have allowed the bicycle to proceed safely, they do tend to get impatient and cross. For that reason, I'm kind of looking for operations that would allow the bicycle to be green for most of the time that a vehicle is green, because I think in the end we'll find that dictates compliance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Portland State did a really nice research report on this by Kirk Paulson, actually, 2013. It was about the same time that survey came out, and they did a lot of video footage. They looked at, I think, 9 or so locations with actually Sam Thompson, Kirk Paulson, Chris Monsier, and Miguel Figliozzi, and found about, as Rock said, about a 90%. They had a wide range of intersections in Oregon, looked at different sorts of movements. Some of the compliance data has shown, that the compliance has been in the 70% range, but once you pull out the right turn on red, I think that's the key thing is making sure that you're not, you're not expecting people not to turn on red, bicycle traffic not to turn red, because of course they can. And they didn't really find any direct correlation between wait time. So that was kind of interesting. It was, of course, it depends on gaps quite a bit. So, yeah, it was a pretty good study. I think, of course, we'd like more data, of course, and thinking about it in terms of a range of things that were going on there. But we contemplate compliance. Certainly, the longer the cycle length, the more potential there is for non-compliance.
And Peter, thanks for mentioning that study. I just dropped the link in the chat pod for everyone to see if you have a chance to look at it. I've managed to find it really quickly, so hopefully that helps answer some of those questions. A really interesting question just came in, and I wanted to get to this one because it hasn't come up yet. And I'll just read the question here. On a street with a cycle track that has bicycle signals at several signalized intersections in a row, how important would you say it is that the bike signals are consistently in the same location at each of the intersections, kind of with relationship maybe to near the pedestrian head or near the other signals, the placement of the head itself? Is there guidance on that? Does the MUTCD interim approval get to that level, and how important do you think that consistency is in terms of where to look?
I have a little bit of experience on that from Long Beach. Maybe it's Long Beach that asked the question. We could not put bicycle signals at every crossing point because we had light rail crossings and it wasn't going to be possible to maintain the downtown cycle length. We did a mixing zone treatment. It was a one-way bikeway, so we could do the mixing zone treatment. And anecdotally, I've had a number of people say there's bike signals everywhere except where it crosses the light rail. Why not? Because it's very confusing. I'm looking for the bike signal and can't find it. Anecdotally, I've also had other people tell me that they like the mixing zone treatment because the signal is green longer than at the locations with the bike signals and the crossing turn arrows.
Yeah, I just chime in. I guess I think it's it's ideal. Of course, there not a lot of situations where you just don't have ideal. I think to the extent that you can put the people in a spot where they can see the traffic control, uniformity is desirable, but especially at the lower speeds of cyclists. My comment or frame is, well, that's you do the best you can with what you've got with the budgets and things of that nature. So. It's of course a struggle. I'd say it's a case by case, and that's why that's why engineers are in business. Is it's not just a cookie cutter one size fits all solution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the interim approval doesn't really speak to that directly. There is a lot of information on how to mount the signal faces, where to mount the signal faces. It does provide another option that I don't think is very often exercised. And Peter did show this in one of the slides where you have a 4-inch near side intersection bicycle signal. The interim approval does provide for that. It's something that I think you could look at if you have a potentially difficult signal head mounting situation on the far side to kind of increase the visibility of the bicycle traffic control. Generally, and I say this, living in a city, Washington, D.C., where we don't allow mast arms to be used, I think that consistency and expectation of where those traffic control devices are mounted is extremely important for drivers to be able to see, but there's always a practicality entering into that as well. And so I think that looking at some other options where you may not be able to put that signal head where you first want it, or you may, rather than installing an entirely new signal pole, you may have to get a little bit more creative. And the interim approval, like I said, does allow for that near side option as well. To give you a little bit more options to make that more conspicuous for bicyclists.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of minutes, and I wanted to get at an issue that you all mentioned. Rock, we saw your survey results showing the abundance of bicycle signal heads that are in use now, and the acknowledgement that there probably isn't data being collected on all of them, and there clearly is a need for us to get more good data to help inform guidance that's out there and send to Dave and his team and hopefully help justify more use and different uses of bicycle signals. So for those who may have bicycle signals and aren't collecting any data currently, are there recommendations that you all have for some ways you can go out and just start collecting some very simple metrics, simple data? And what would those be? What kinds of observations would you would you recommend people start collecting and compiling?
Well, the first thing is we'd appreciate it if you would just tell us where they are, what city. If we ever find funding to do a follow-up with detail, it'll be very important to know where they're all located. Visual observations of conflicts would be helpful. That can be done by video where possible. If they've been out there for more than a year or so, we could probably do some realistic look to see if there have been any actual bicycle-related collisions. That's not so easy for researchers from out of state to do. It's a lot easier for the people in the agency that installed the intersection. That's where I would start. In the end, if it gets good compliance and the safety works well, that should argue that it is a good application.
Okay. And Dave, any other tips for data collection or what to measure and what to look at?
I think Rock was right on the money there. I think that what ultimately we're concerned with is the conflicts, seeing what kind of conflicts result and seeing what kind of behaviors exhibited when drivers and when bicyclists cross paths at these locations, because we are putting out these signals. What we really ultimately want to know is what's their actual effect. What are drivers and what are bicyclists taking away from both of these? And so, yeah, observations of conflict are extremely important. If there is crash data, if there's a good enough data set to be able to say before and after, that's something that would be very helpful as well. And as well, if there's a way to do, kind of like I said earlier, if there's a way to do an intercept or a survey to see what drivers and bicyclists understand when they see these signals, what kind of messages they take away, ultimately that can help inform us at FHWA whether or not, we decide to change the interim approval to allow some additional uses, because what we have to make sure is that people understand the meaning that we're intending to convey when we put these things out there. But if there's any specifics, and I definitely want to reach out, if there's anybody considering an experiment or anything like that, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help work with you to be able to craft a plan that can fit within your available resources for data collection and observation.
Great. And comment from Bill DeSantis, who's the chair of the technical committee on the bicycle side of things for the NCUTCD, just asking anyone who's got information to forward that to the NCUTCD team. Those numbers are really helpful in providing that base of knowledge. So thanks, Bill, for sending that in.
The one other thing that comes to mind is if you've done any treatments to mitigate or reduce conflicts that do not involve bicycle operation, such as bike lane extensions through the intersection, use of green paint, and things like that. I think ultimately those types of measures might be what we'll look at for less intense locations.
Great. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and it's been a really good discussion. The presentations were awesome. I know we didn't get to every question, but I do hope that folks can reach back out to us. If you have more questions, we can point you in the right direction. We'd be glad to do that. You are going to be receiving an email this afternoon, in about an hour actually, with a link to our archive page for the webinar, instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance, and information about some upcoming webinars. So keep an eye out for that. A brief survey is going to greet you as you close the session today. We really would appreciate your thoughts, your feedback, and maybe some ideas about sessions we could plan next. So let us know about that in the survey. I just want to say thanks again to Peter Koontz, Rock Miller, and Dave Kirshner for their presentations and participation today. And thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.